Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, hadith number 25 in the TheProphet'sLegacy, guarding your tongue when you are fasting. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إِذَا أَصْبَحَ أَحَدُكُمْ يَوْمًا صَائِمًا فَلَا يَرْفَثْ وَلَا يَجْهَلْ فَإِنِ امْرُؤٌ شَاتَمَهُ أَوْ قَاتَلَهُ فَلْيَقُلْ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ. When one of you begins the day fasting, then let him not make rafath, which is to speak obscene speech, and let him not make jahala, which is to do things which are foolish, or to say things which are foolish. And when somebody abuses him or fights him, then let him say, Verily I am fasting, indeed I am fasting. We find both in this hadith and the one preceding, إِذَا دُعِيَ أَحَدُكُمْ إِلَى طَعَامٍ وَهُوَ صَائِمٌ فَلْيَقُلْ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ. In both of these hadith, you are outwardly proclaiming to the other person that you are fasting. But should you not hide your ibadah? Well, we say you should always hide your ibadah. However, you could come across occasions in which the need dictates that you should let the other person know about your ibadah. In both of these ahadith, we have a particular need for you to proclaim your ibadah, the Siyaam in this case. In the first one, you are invited to some food and you cannot eat, so the other person will be wondering, why is he not eating? So you would have to make it known, otherwise they may take it the wrong way. And in this hadith, there is also a need to make it known that you are fasting. There are three reasons. The first reason, it serves as a rebuke against the one who is abusing you or fighting you. And then secondly, it makes it known that the only reason you are not retaliating is because you're fasting and you have a higher standard of character. Otherwise, it's not like you're too weak to retaliate. And the third reason, it is to teach the one abusing you that the person who is fasting does not reciprocate evil actions with evil actions, even though normally he would be allowed to do so. وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا. And the reward or the recompense of an evil is an evil like unto it. Hadith number 26. The virtue of the Siyaam. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, كُلُّ عَمَلِ ابْنِ آدَمَ يُضَاعَفُ الْحَسَنَةُ عَشَرُ أَمْثَالِهَا إِلَى 700 ضِعْفٍ. All actions of the son of Adam are multiplied 10 times the amount up till 700. قال الله عز وجل إلا الصوم. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, except the fasting. فإنه لي وأنا أجزي به. Because it is for me and I reward it accordingly. يدع شهوته وطعامه من أجلي. The fasting person leaves his desires and his food for my sake. للصائم فرحتان. For the fasting person there are two joys. فرحة عند فطره, a joy when he breaks the fast. وفرحة عند لقاء ربه, and a joy when he meets his Rabb. وَلَا خَلُوفُ فِيهِ أَطْيَبُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ رِيحِ الْمِسْكِ. And the change of his smell of his mouth is better with Allah than the fragrance of misk, which is a perfume. This is a hadith Qudsi, because the Prophet is reporting what Allah said. The hadith tells us here that the fasting is for me, that's what Allah says. But all acts of ibadah are for Allah. Some ulama said that the fasting is an act of ibadah where no one besides Allah has been worshipped with this. So the kuffar worshipping the false gods, they never did it by fasting for their sake. They would have worshipped their false gods by other means like the salah or sujood and stuff like that. Some other scholars said it's because there's no showing off in fasting. You cannot tell the difference between a fasting person and the one not fasting. Thus your ikhlas is more pure. So for example, if you're reciting the Quran or you are performing the Salah or the Hajj, you can easily adorn this action if you see someone of eminence looking at you, just to impress them of course. But how do you adorn the fasting? It has also been said because not eating and drinking is something attributed to Allah. He does not eat and drink. So you are imitating the attribute of Allah to draw closer to Him. Others have said that what Allah means here is that only I know the extent of his reward, or exactly how much it will be multiplied. Whereas with the other good deeds, Allah Jalla wa Ala has made it plain to the other creation, for example the malaika, how much He is going to multiply their good deeds by. Others have said that the reason why Allah said that the fasting is for me is a ta'zeem or a veneration of the fasting. Otherwise, it is true that all actions are for Allah. And this is similar to how Allah says in the Quran, Naqat Allah, the she-camel of Allah, despite the fact that all she-camels ultimately belong to Allah, as well as everything else in the universe. But that she-camel of Salih was a special she-camel. So Allah Jalla wa Ala makes a tashrif of it. He honors it. Other scholars have said that the reward of the Siyaam can never be taken away from you. So if, for example, you wronged someone, then that person oppressed by you could take some of your good deeds, but they said he will not be able to take your Siyaam. So then, these are some of the various opinions given on this hadith.
Now, from the context, it appears that the better opinion is that Allah alone knows the extent of the reward of the fasting, and that there does not have to be an upper limit to the reward of the fasting.
We find from this hadith that we are the children of Adam, who was the first man. And this is in contradiction to the popular evolution theory circulating nowadays. This theory teaches us that we come ultimately from primordial slime, and Allah Jalla wa Ala teaches us that that is a complete lie. We came from the loins of Adam alayhi salam. We learn from the hadith that the change in breath of the fasting person is better with Allah than perfume. Does this mean you should not do miswak because it will remove this smell of the mouth? The answer is no. The miswak is legislated all the time, even during the fasting as well. And then the smell is not coming from the mouth, it comes from the stomach, from the inside. In another hadith of the chapter, the Prophet ﷺ said, "As-siyamu junnah." The fasting is a shield. It is a shield for you in this world and in the hereafter. It shields you from bad behavior because you're always conscious of your behavior. You know you don't want to spoil your fasting because it requires effort, and you don't want your effort to go to waste. It is a shield for you in the hereafter in that it protects you from the fire. So again, a plain virtue of fasting. We find that the fasting person has two joys. The first joy when he breaks the fast. What does that mean? It means he has completed a whole day of fasting. It's a long, continuous act of ibadah. There's no other act of ibadah which is quite as long and continuous as the fasting. And when he finally gets to break it, he has this sense of achievement that he's soldiered through and overcome his desires for a day and has completed this act of ibadah, this sense of achievement, and also the joy of eating that which was haram upon him previously. And then the second joy is far more straightforward, the joy when he meets his Rabb and he finds that this effort of his did not go to waste. Rather, Allah Jalla wa Ala will reward him many fold, which only Allah Jalla wa Ala knows how much. As we learn in the hadith that your good deeds could be multiplied 10 times all the way up to 700, but the fasting, Allah knows how much it is multiplied, far more than 700. Also in the same chapter, we find the Prophet said that amongst the doors of Jannah, there is one called Ar-Rayyan, and there are 8 doors of Jannah altogether, 7 of Jahannam. But anyway, one door is called Ar-Rayyan, and it is specific for all those who fasted. So all of these ahadith which you have heard, about the Siyaam being a junnah, a shield, about the Ar-Rayyan door specific for the Sa'imun, and about the hadith in which the deeds are multiplied except the fasting which is specifically for Allah, and the various interpretations for that, and that he has 2 joys. All of this information found in these ahadith tell us that you should try to fast as much as you can, especially during the recommended times. Hadith number 27. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, the Prophet said, "Man sama yawman fi sabilillahi azza wa jalla ba'ada Allahu wajhahu 'anil nari 70 kharifan." Whoever fasts in the way of Allah for one day, then Allah will set his face afar from the fire, a distance of 70 autumns, meaning 70 years. Some people may interpret this to be a fasting person fighting in the way of Allah. But it appears to us this is not the meaning, because we know when the Prophet and the companions went to conquer Mecca, it was in Ramadan and they were fasting. And the Prophet ordered them to break their fast, because this would be stronger for you. You would have the energy to fight. So fi sabilillah does not mean fighting in the way of Allah, rather it means in the Sharia of Allah. So you adhere to the laws of the Sharia as you fast. Otherwise, the Jews and the Christians can also fast, but they will not be adhering to the laws of the Sharia. So adhering to the laws of the Sharia basically means with ikhlas and following the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So from this hadith, yet another virtue of fasting, and this encourages us to take up the nawafil or the optional fasting. Hadith number 28, fasting and nafila fast midway through the day. From Aisha, she says, the Prophet entered a house one day and he asked her, Hal عندكم shay? Do you have something, meaning something to eat? She says, no. The Prophet replies, فإني إذن صائم. Well, in that case, I am fasting. She says that he came to the house another day and she said to him, O Messenger of Allah, hays has been given to us. And this is a mixture of dried date and cheese and butter. It's all mixed together. And then the Prophet said to her, Arini فَلَقَدْ أَصْبَحْتُ صَائِمًا. Show me it, because I started the day fasting. And she said, then he ate from it. So we learn from this vital narration that if you're fasting a nafila fast, you don't need to have the niyyah from the fajr time, but you do with the fard fasting. And that you can begin your nafila fasting midway through the day. But the reward, however, will count from the time you started the fast, not from the beginning of the day, because your deeds are by your intention. But of course, if you're going to do that, it is a condition that you have not eaten anything since the fajr time. And so this is what we can take from the Prophet's statement, فَإِنِّي إِذًا صَائِمٌ. Then in that case, I am fasting. So he started the fasting from that particular time. Some scholars said that that particular time needs to be before the zawal time. However, we don't find any particular evidence for that. It could be at any time, so that your nafila fasting may even last half an hour, as long as you haven't eaten anything since the fajr time, in which case you are rewarded for half an hour's worth of fasting. We find the Prophet said out aloud that he's fasting. Do you proclaim your niyyah out aloud? Well, no, you don't, and the only reason the Prophet said this out aloud was to make it plain that you are allowed to start your fasting midway through the day if it is a nafila fasting. And going the other way around, you're allowed to break the fast if you want to eat something, and this is of course the nafila fasting. The fard fast you're not allowed to break. And so if someone invites you to a banquet or to a walima, then we know that you can tell him that you're fasting, so you don't have to eat anything, but you can still attend the event. However, if you want to, then you can break the fast and eat. And this would be particularly a good idea if he takes offense to you not eating. We also take from this narration that the Prophet would eat from a gift, because he would not eat from the charity, so there's a difference there. We find that a nafila act of ibadah, you are allowed to leave it for a particular reason, such as this one here in the hadith. Only when it comes to the hajj and the umrah, then you're not allowed to leave that, even if it is a nafila, because when it begins, then it is so much forcefully in effect that you're not allowed to leave it until you have completed the rites. It could be wajib for you to leave a nafila action. For example, if you start a nafila prayer after the iqamah for the jama'ah has been given, then it is wajib upon you to leave this nafila prayer. Hadith number 29, about when you eat forgetfully. From Abu Huraira, the Prophet said, Man nasiya wa huwa sa'im, fa'akala aw shariba, falyutimma sawmahu fa'innama at'amahu Allahu wa saqah. Whoever forgetfully eats or drinks whilst he is fasting, then let him complete his sawm, because only Allah made him eat and gave him to drink. This hadith is self-explanatory. If you forgetfully eat or drink whilst you're in a state of fasting, then this does not harm your fast. Why? Because you did not do it intentionally. To break the fast, 3 conditions must be met. That you must be alim, dhakir and mukhtar, knowledgeable of the ruling, and you remembered the ruling, and you did it by choice as opposed to being forced. Hadith number 30, about fasting other months besides Ramadan. From Aisha, she says that the Prophet would fast such that we would say he's not going to stop fasting, and he would refrain from fasting until we would say he's not going to be fasting. And she says that he never completed a whole month of fasting except Ramadan, and I never saw him fast more frequently in any month than Sha'ban. In the same chapter, she also says that the Prophet would say, خُذُوا مِنَ الْأَعْمَالِ مَا تُطِيقُونَ. Do only those actions which you are able to, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَن يَمَلَّ حَتَّى تَمَلُّوا. Because Allah will not cease giving you the reward until you cease doing those actions. And the Prophet would also say, أَحَبُّ الْعَمَلِ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى مَا دَاوَمَ عَلَيْهِ صَاحِبُهُ وَإِنْ قَلَّ. The most beloved actions to Allah are the ones that the doer does most frequently or continuously, even if the action itself is small in nature. So we find then that Sha'ban was a popular month for fasting with the Prophet. It was almost as if he is preparing for Ramadan. That's why he would fast that month more than any other month besides Ramadan. It would be like the Ratib Sunnah before the Fard. There is a narration which says that when the halfway of Sha'ban comes in, then do not fast. We take this to mean that do not begin fasting from the halfway mark of Sha'ban, but if it's the case that you're fasting from before, meaning the first half of Sha'ban, then of course you can continue on till the last part as well.
And this is on the condition that we take that hadith to be authentic, because many scholars have graded it to be da'if.
The word used in the other narration is malal, which means when you grow weary or tired of something. So Allah does not grow weary or tired until you grow weary or tired. But does Allah Jalla wa Ala grow weary or tired? Well, we say yes, but it is not like us growing weary or tired. In this context, it means when He stops rewarding you. So whenever you stop your actions, He stops rewarding you. But we know of a surety that Allah Jalla wa Ala does not grow tired in the way we grow tired and weary.
So in other words, we can say that this wording is a kinaya. That is to say, it is to be understood in terms of its consequences. That is, when you grow tired, you stop working. So that's the consequence of growing tired. So Allah growing tired means He stops rewarding you. In a similar way where Allah Jalla wa Ala says, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, or you have touched women. This does not mean you've touched women, let's say, with your hands. Rather, it is referring to sexual intercourse. It is a kinaya, one expression to denote another. And yet those two expressions have an intimate link between them.
Hadith number 31, about not fasting all the time. This is a longer narration where Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As would fast every day consecutively, and he would wake up for the salah every night consecutively. And the Prophet got to know about this. And then the Prophet came to Ibn al-As to seek confirmation of this news. Is it true you fast every day consecutively and pray every night consecutively? And he admitted to doing so. And he said that he only wants goodness thereby. The Prophet told him, but it would be enough for you to fast 3 days every month. But he said, I'm able to do more than that. The Prophet told him, but your wife has a right over you, and your visitor has a right over you, and your body has a right over you. So fast the fasting of Dawood alayhi salam, the Prophet of Allah, because he was the one most dedicated to the worship of Allah. And so he asked, what is this fasting? The Prophet replied, he would fast one day and break the fast the next day. And as for reciting the Quran, then recite the whole Quran through a period of 1 month, not one night. But he said, I'm able to do more than that. Then the Prophet told him, well then recite every 20 days. He said, I'm able to do more than that. The Prophet said, well then recite every 10 days. He said, I can do more than that. Then the Prophet said, well recite every 7 days. And do not increase on this, because your wife has a right over you, your visitor has a right over you, and your body has a right over you. We take the important lesson from this hadith. Do not go to extremes in your act of ibadah, because you're going to burn yourself out. You will be able to keep it up for, let's say, about a month, but after that you'll burn yourself out and you will not be able to continue. So therefore, it is far better to reduce the quantity of your ibadah, but make it permanent and regular. This is what is beloved to Allah Jalla wa Ala, not the quantity or the concentration of your ibadah. We can take that following the sunnah is better than the quantity of your ibadah, because in a narration, when Ibn al-As says that he's able to do more than that, the Prophet says there is nothing better than what I have mentioned. So following the sunnah takes precedence over the magnitude of your ibadah. Hadith number 32 in the same chapter, from Ibn al-As, the Prophet said, Ya Abdullah, la takun بمثل فلان كان يقوم الليل فترك قيامه. O Abdullah, do not be like such and such a person who used to get up for the nighttime prayer, but then he abandoned it. And this could easily happen when you do too much. For the first few weeks or months, you'll be able to keep it up, but then you'll abandon it. What the Prophet is telling us here in this hadith, don't be the one who begins his act of ibadah, but then he burns himself out, and abandons the ibadah. So therefore what you ought to do is to reduce the quantity, yet maintaining the regularity. Hadith 33. From Abdullah ibn Amr again, the Prophet said, أحب الصيام إلى الله صيام داود وأحب الصلاة إلى الله صلاة داود عليه السلام كان ينام نصف الليل ويقوم ثلثه وينام سدسه وكان يصوم يوما ويفطر يوما. The most beloved fast is that of Dawood, and the most beloved salah is that of Dawood. He would sleep for half the night, pray a third, and sleep for the last sixth. And then as for the fasting, he would fast a day and break the fast the next day. So like this, he would fast alternate days. Fasting every single day is not legislated, it is against Sunnah. In one of the wording of this chapter, we find the Prophet saying, La sama man sama al-abad. The one who fasts every day consecutively, non-stop, has not fasted. Now one way of interpreting this wording of the hadith, La sama man sama al-abad, is that you're going to burn yourself out, and you will end up not fasting. Another interpretation is that you become so used to fasting that you do not feel a sense of sacrifice that you do when you're normally fasting. So the fasting, if you like, loses its luster. In fasting, you should feel a sense of sacrifice that you are making to Allah Jalla wa Ala. Hadith number 34. From Abu Qatada al-Ansari, the Prophet was being asked some questions, and from the questions he was asked was the idea about fasting a day and breaking the fast the next day. He said, ذَاكَ صَوْمُ أَخِي دَاوُودَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. That is the fasting of my brother Dawood alayhi salam. He was asked about the fast of Monday. He replied, ذَاكَ يَوْمٌ وُلِدْتُ فِيهِ وَيَوْمٌ بُعِثْتُ فِيهِ. That was the day I was born and the day I was sent as a messenger. Or he said, أُنزِلَ عَلَيَّ فِيهِ. The Quran was sent down to me on that day. And the Prophet went on to say, صَوْمُ ثَلَاثَةٍ مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ وَرَمَضَانَ إِلَى رَمَضَانَ صَوْمُ دَهْرٍ. Fasting 3 days from every month and from Ramadan to Ramadan is like fasting every day, meaning all throughout the time. He was asked about the fasting on Yawm Arafah. He says, يُكَفِّرُ السَّنَةَ الْمَاضِيَةَ وَالْبَاقِيَةَ. It expiates the sins of the preceding year and the remaining year. And was asked about the fasting of Ashura. He says, يُكَفِّرُ السَّنَةَ الْمَاضِيَةَ. It expiates the sins of the previous year. We find from the statement of Aisha in the Sahih, she says that the Prophet would not care which 3 days he would fast during the month. Any 3 would do. The best of these 3 would be the Ayyamul Bid, the 3 white days, 13, 14 and 15th of the month where we have the full moon. Otherwise it matters not when you fast. What is recommended are the 3 days. People use this hadith as evidence to celebrate the Prophet's birthday, because the Prophet mentions the special day in which he was born, and this was also the day in which he was sent as a messenger, or he said the Quran was sent down to him. And those who celebrate the Prophet's birthday are making absolutely no sense, neither from the text nor from rational thoughts. As far as the text is concerned, there is no evidence to suggest that you do celebrate the Prophet's birthday. In fact, this hadith is an evidence against them, because this would have been the opportune moment for the Prophet to tell his people to celebrate his birthday, seeing as though he was talking about this particular day on which he was born, the Monday. But he does not go beyond saying that you fast this day. So he did not tell his companions to have a street party and playing the drums and music and singing and all sorts. That's the textual angle. As for rational thought, then the Prophet being born is not a virtue nor a benefit to anyone, any time, any place. The Prophet's birth was no different to any other baby's birth. It's just as simple as a child being born. Children are born every day by the millions. Rather, the virtue or the benefit to mankind is when the Prophet was sent as the Prophet, not the day he was born. Rather, it was the day he was sent as the Prophet. Notice they don't celebrate him being sent as a Prophet. If anything is worthy to be celebrated, it is the fact that he was sent as a Prophet and a messenger, not merely born. So, from these 2 angles, celebrating the Prophet's birthday simply makes no sense. Your guidance as a Muslim is not because the Prophet was born. No, rather, it is because the Prophet was sent by Allah as a messenger. And even if it is the day when the Prophet was born, then they ought to be consistent and celebrate every Monday, every week. Again, you don't find them doing that. With their lack of consistency and rationale, it just goes to show that they're just following their own desires. It's not based on any sound principles or text or rationale, just what feels right to them. Well, what feels right to you is never a source of guidance. Allah Jalla wa Ala informs us in the Quran, لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَإِنْ كَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. Allah has conferred a great favor on the mu'mineen when He sent them a messenger from amongst themselves, reciting unto them His ayat and purifying them and instructing them in the book and the hikmah, taken to mean the sunnah, where previously they were in manifest misguidance. But notice how Allah says that the favor is when He sent them this messenger, not when He made the messenger born. And we also pick up from this hadith the virtuous action of fasting Yawm Arafah and Ashura.
Also, just a few other points of benefit. In the narration of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As and how he went to extremes, the Prophet asked him, "Are you the one who is standing up in prayer all night long and fasting all day long?" From this we can take that you need to make sure that somebody is doing something wrong before you correct them. Also, Abdullah revealed what he was doing, and it is permissible to reveal your actions if you are safe from showing off and if there is a need to do so, such as in this context. Also, we find he says that he only intended good by it. Intending good and following the sunnah are two different things. You can certainly intend the good, and certainly you will be rewarded for your goodly intention. But that does not mean to say that you are following the sunnah. And our aim is to follow the sunnah, not merely to intend that which we deem to be good. So ponder over that. Also, in the Prophet ﷺ recommending the fasting of Dawood, we may take that the sharia of those before us applies to us, except when we have an exception. Also, with regards to reciting the Quran, he was doing it every night. The Prophet said, no, do it every month. Then he reduced it to every 20 days, then every 10 days, and then reduced it to 7, and he said, do not exceed beyond that. Meaning to say, do not recite the Quran in less than 7 days. We have other narrations which talk about 3 days. In the Sunan, لا يفقه من قرأ القرآن في أقل من 3. The one who recites the Quran in less than 3 days has not understood it. And there is also an order format as well from the Prophet telling us not to recite the Quran in less than 3 days. So we say, according to this, do not recite the Quran, meaning the whole of the Quran, in less than 3 days. Spread it out so that you may ponder over what you are reciting. You may find righteous people completing the Quran in less than 3 days, but we say that the Sunnah of the Prophet is most worthy to be followed.
Hadith 35, fasting the end of Sha'ban, from Imran ibn Husayn radiyallahu anh. The Prophet asked him, meaning Imran ibn Husayn, Asumta min surari Sha'ban? Did you fast the last part of Sha'ban? He replied, no. The Prophet said, فَإِذَا أَفْطَرْتَ فَصُمْ يَوْمَيْنِ. If you did not fast, then fast 2 days. Now this narration clearly proves to us that you can fast the last part of Sha'ban. There is a hadith which tells us that when half of Sha'ban comes, then do not fast. But like we said before, this hadith, the latter one in the Sunan, would have to be taken to mean do not begin the fasting from the halfway point. But if you began it from the beginning, then you can continue on and there's no problem. Hadith number 36, about the fast of Al-Muharram. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, أفضل الصيام بعد رمضان شهر الله المحرم وأفضل الصلاة بعد الفريضة صلاة الليل. The most virtuous fasting after Ramadan is the month of Allah Al-Muharram, and the most virtuous salah after the fard salah is the nighttime prayer. Some have said the fasting of Al-Muharram is referring to the Ashura fasting, but this is not what is apparent. What is apparent is that the most virtuous fasting is done in the month of Al-Muharram, which includes the Ashura, but is not restricted to the Ashura. But this month should not be fasted in totality. Only Ramadan is to be fasted in totality. What this hadith would suggest to us is that the Salatul Layl is even more virtuous than the Rawatib Sunan before and after the Fard prayers. And if that's the case, then we can understand why standing up in the nighttime prayer is a big sacrifice, because you want to sleep. So you've sacrificed your natural desire to sleep for the sake of Allah Jalla wa Ala. The more you sacrifice, the more virtuous your act is. Hadith number 37, about the 6 days of Shawwal after Ramadan. From Abu Ayyub, the Prophet said, من صام رمضان ثم أتبعه ستا من شوال كان كصيام الدهر. Whoever fasts Ramadan and follows it up with 6 from Shawwal, then it's as if he is fasting the whole of the time. Well, this hadith is clear enough. It is highly recommended to fast 6 days in Shawwal. So this would be the reward equivalent to you fasting every day. And 2 points to note here. The first important point, it must be after Ramadan fasting. So if you have any fasting to make up for Ramadan, you must do those first and then the Shawwal fasting. And you're not allowed to combine. They absolutely must be separate. Because the Prophet said, ثُمَّ أَتْبَعَهُ, and then he follows it up. So there is a definite chronological order. The second important point is that these fasting of the 6 in Shawwal do not need to be consecutive, because the Prophet leaves it in the absolute sense. Therefore we leave it in the absolute sense. And there's no evidence to suggest that they must be consecutive. Hadith number 38, about Laylatul Qadr. From Ibn Umar, he says that some of the companions saw Laylatul Qadr in their dreams. And this was during the last 7 days of Ramadan. So they told the Prophet about it, and he said, أرى رؤياكم قد تواطأت في السبع الأواخر فمن كان متحريها فليتحرها في السبع الأواخر. I see that your dreams are agreeing with each other, that the Laylatul Qadr is in the last 7. So whoever is seeking it out, then let him seek it in the last 7 nights. In another narration of the chapter, a man saw it on the night of the 27th. And the Prophet said, I see your dreams are telling you that it's in the last 10 nights. So seek it in the odd nights of those last 10. So in that narration, the word witr is used, which means odd. In another narration of the same chapter, the Prophet saw Laylatul Qadr in his dream, and he saw that in the following morning he is prostrating on mud. So what happened was that one night it was raining and the water seeped through to the ground, and during the morning the Prophet was prostrating, and because the ground became muddy he prostrated on mud, and this was the morning of the 21st. So in other words, in that narration, the Laylatul Qadr was on the 21st night. Also in the chapter, the Prophet said, إِنِّي أُرِيتُ لَيْلَةَ الْقَدْرِ وَإِنِّي نَسِيتُهَا أو أُنْسِيتُهَا فَالْتَمِسُوهَا فِي الْعَشْرِ الْأَوَاخِرِ مِنْ كُلِّ وِتْرٍ وَإِنِّي رَأَيْتُ أَنِّي أَسْجُدُ فِي مَاءٍ وَطِينٍ فَمَنْ كَانَ اعْتَكَفَ مَعَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ فَلْيَرْجِعْ. He says, I saw the Laylatul Qadr, but then I forgot it, or I was made to forget it, so seek it in the odd of the last 10, and I saw myself prostrating on water and mud. So whoever was making i'tikaf with the Messenger of Allah, then let him return and continue this i'tikaf, because the Laylatul Qadr is in the last 10. Also in the chapter from Ubay ibn Ka'ab, his statement, where he claims that the Laylatul Qadr is the night of the 27th, and he says that the sign is that the sun rises without its rays. He says this is what the Prophet informed him of. There is another narration from Abdullah ibn Unais that the Prophet is saying that he saw himself prostrating after the Laylatul Qadr on water and mud, and Ibn Unais says that the night when it rained was the 23rd as opposed to the 21st, which we have just heard. The narration of the night of the 21st is from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, and the one which mentions 23rd is from Abdullah ibn Unais. Now either these are 2 separate incidents, and if they're not 2 separate incidents, if it just happened once, then it is likely that one of the narrators has got his numbers wrong. But ultimately this does not damage the authenticity of the hadith, because what date it is not really important. What is important here is that we know it is in the last 10 days of Ramadan, and that the odd nights are more emphasized than the even ones. And from the odd nights, the 27th is more emphasized than the rest of the odds. So this is the order of priority. But we say, for all practical purposes, you must stand every one of these nights up for the salah. And this is the sunnah. The Prophet would spend the whole 10 nights up in salah, and he would not go to sleep. And this is what Aisha says, and this is the sunnah. Notice the Sahaba saw this true vision. The Prophet also saw this true vision about Laylatul Qadr. The Prophet has informed us about true dreams. وَرُؤْيَ الْمُؤْمِنِ جُزْءٌ مِّن 46 جُزْءًا مِّنَ النُّبُوَّةِ في آخر الزمان لا تكاد رؤيا المؤمن تكذب وأصدقكم حديثا أصدقكم رؤيا. The true dream of a mu'min is 1 out of 46th part of prophethood, and during the end times the dream of the mu'min would scarcely be wrong, and the truest of you in his speech is the one who sees the truest dreams. Now this fraction 1 out of 46, we say the number is not intended in and of itself, because we find different varying fractions given. 1 out of 45 is given, 1 out of 70 can be given, various fractions are given. The number is not intended in and of itself. What is intended is that these true dreams are a little taster of prophethood. This is what the prophets would have experienced, true visions from Allah Jalla wa Ala, which would be revelations from Allah. And so here Allah Jalla wa Ala gives you a little taster of prophethood. Of course, it does not make you into a prophet, but it's a taster. It's giving you something of what the prophets would have experienced. Laylatul Qadr, either pronounced as Qadr with a fatha or Qadr with a sukoon. If it's Qadr with a sukoon, then this means high status. Because Laylatul Qadr has high Qadr or high status and honor. As for Qadr, that means decree. That's because that is the night where everything is decreed for the following year. So that's a yearly decree. And so these are the two meanings of this word. You often see it translated as a night of power, and there's no basis for that. We find that the weightier opinion is that this night of Laylatul Qadr does not have to be fixed. So it may not be the 27th every year. Rather, we have evidence to suggest that it does move. Some evidence talking about it being 27th, some evidence, as you've heard, talking about being 21st. It seems that this night moves. We find also that the Prophet was prostrating on mud. You often find nowadays people saying, I don't want to pray because my clothes are dirty. And this is simple foolishness. The Prophet here is prostrating on mud. And we find nowadays people refusing to pray because their clothes are muddy or dirty. And one ought not to let Shaitan play with him. As for this difference in the numbers, was it raining on the 21st or 23rd? It seems to us that the narration of Abu Sa'id, which talks about the 21st, is weightier, because the ulama would have to make a tarjih, they would have to give more weighting to one evidence over the other. And we would have to say that the narration of Abdullah ibn Unais, there is a wahm, or somebody is mistaken there. This is because the narration of Abdullah ibn Unais is only found in Muslim, and the other one of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri is found in Muslim and al-Bukhari. Therefore we would give it more weight. Hadith number 39 about al-i'tikaf from Aisha. She says the Prophet would make i'tikaf in the last 10 of Ramadan until he died, and then after that his wives made i'tikaf. I'tikaf meaning when you stick to something and you adhere to it. So here we are adhering to the masjid for the sake of ibadah in terms of the salah and the dhikr and recital of the Quran. Unfortunately nowadays you find many people just socializing in the masjid as they make i'tikaf, and this is a mistake and they must be taught. The purpose of i'tikaf is that you seek Laylatul Qadr. It can be done in any masjid, not just the Al-Masjid Al-Haram or Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa or Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi. Any masjid would do, because the ayah in the Quran is general. Do not touch your wives, meaning sexually, whilst you are mu'takif in the masajid. It is general. As for the hadith which talks about the 3 big masajid, then even if it is authentic, it would mean that there's no perfect type of i'tikaf except in those 3. It is not legislated to make i'tikaf in other than the last 10 nights of Ramadan. But if you have made a vow to do i'tikaf, then you must fulfill the vow. We find also that the woman can make i'tikaf in the masjid. The house is not a place of i'tikaf, only the masjid is, for men and for women. Now women can make i'tikaf in the masjid, not in the home, as long as we can be safe from the fitna. Maybe they have a separate section or something like this, in which case there's no problem. And the wives we see made i'tikaf also in the masjid. Hadith 40, about when he enters the masjid. From Aisha, she says, when the Prophet wanted to make i'tikaf, he prayed the Fajr, then he entered his mu'takaf, the place of his i'tikaf, and he ordered the tent to be put up. He wanted to make i'tikaf in the last 10 nights of Ramadan. And she says that Zainab also ordered a tent to be put up, and the other wives also did the same thing. So when the Prophet prayed the Fajr, he saw these tents, and he said, Al-birra turidna, is it righteousness that you want? And he ordered that his tent be taken down, and he left the i'tikaf in the month of Ramadan, and he made up for it in the first 10 days of Shawwal. One wife orders a tent to be built, and then the other wives follow. Why is this? The Prophet realized that this is not because they want righteousness or to draw closer to Allah, but rather it is because of the jealousy. Co-wives can become jealous of each other, and this is one of the mafsada, or the corruption in having multiple wives, that they can become jealous. This is the downside. And so this is why they ordered the tents to be put up, because they were competing with each other. It was not for the sake of drawing closer to Allah. The Prophet became angry and he brought his tent down and left the i'tikaf, and he made up for it during the first 10 of Shawwal. Of course, Laylatul Qadr is not in the first 10 of Shawwal, but this is him making up for the sunnah. Normally when it comes to sunnah actions, you don't make up for it after its time. But you can make up for it if there is a valid reason. So for example, if you missed one of the rawatib sunan through no fault of your own, then you can make up for that after its time, as long as you did not miss it intentionally. The Salat al-Witr, maybe you missed that. You can make up for that during the next morning, praying an even number, of course. And we find here that i'tikaf can also be made up for in Shawwal. As for the i'tikaf, then we have a clear evidence for this, and the evidence you have just heard, this narration. As for when you enter the i'tikaf, then it is from the Maghrib time. You must be in the masjid, so the Maghrib of the 21st. As for Aisha saying that he would enter his mu'takaf after the Fajr, then this would be the actual tent in which he's in. It is not referring to the masjid. So notice the difference between the masjid and the actual tent, your private place where you are. You must be in the masjid at Maghrib time of the 21st, because that is when the last 10 nights begin. Hadith 41, about striving hard in the last 10. Aisha says that when the last 10 would begin, the Prophet would give life to the night, meaning to say he would wake up, he would not go to sleep, and he would wake up his family as well, and he would become serious, and he would tie his mi'zar, so he would tie up his izar. Now this could have two interpretations, tying up your izar. Firstly, it could mean like when you roll your sleeves up, you're ready for some hard work. And second interpretation is that he would not have conjugal relations with his wife. And we find that both interpretations are good. The last 10 is not the time to be having conjugal relations with the wife, and it is a time to be working hard in terms of the salah. So this time, these nights, are a time for salah. No other act of ibadah is to be focused on here, because otherwise you could talk about seeking knowledge, you could talk about giving charity, you could talk about joining ties of kinship, you could talk about many good actions, but the focus needs to be on the salah. Everything else you can do during other times as well. Hadith 42, about fasting the 10 of Dhul Hijjah. From Aisha, she says that the Prophet did not fast the 10, meaning the 10 of Dhul Hijjah. One might take from this that you do not fast the first 9 days of Dhul Hijjah, where your deeds are most beloved to Allah. When she talks about the 10, she intends here 9. However, in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, we have a hadith from Hunayda ibn Khalid, in which one of the wives of the Prophet said, the Prophet would fast 9 days of Dhul Hijjah and Yawm Ashura, and 3 days from every month, and the Monday and Thursday. This is reported in Abu Dawud, also in Ahmad and An-Nasa'i. So here she is enlisting the recommended types of fasting, and from them the 9 days of Dhul Hijjah. So how do we reconcile these conflicting evidences? Well, We can say Aisha is narrating what she knew. She did not see the Prophet fast, but the other wife is reporting what she saw. She saw the Prophet fast. And we give precedence to the affirmative evidence, not to the negative evidence. Why? Because the affirmative evidence gives us more knowledge, or an increase in knowledge, whereas the negative evidence is sticking to the status quo. Because the status quo is that you don't fast, unless there is evidence otherwise. And it could also be that when Aisha saw the Prophet not fasting, it could be due to a particular reason, something preventing the Prophet. So in conclusion, we say
that fasting the first 9 days of Dhul Hijjah is sunnah, and comes under the generality of the hadith that there are no days in which actions are more beloved to Allah than the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. Just a few more points of benefit. The masjid in which i'tikaf takes place needs to be a masjid in which the 5 times salah take place. Though it is not obligatory that the Salatul Jumu'ah should take place in this masjid, because the mu'takif on the Friday can easily leave the masjid to go to the Salatul Jumu'ah in another masjid, and that is permissible, because it is permissible to leave the masjid during the i'tikaf for a necessity, such as going to the Salatul Jumu'ah, or such as relieving himself, and so on. Also, with the wives of the Prophet and how the Prophet left off the i'tikaf, we may say that the wife should seek permission from the husband if performing i'tikaf in the masjid. Also, the fact that the Prophet performed the i'tikaf in the Shawwal, making up for the Ramadan which he cut off from, we may say that the i'tikaf can be done without fasting, because in Shawwal this is not the month of fasting, and that the i'tikaf does not have to be done in Ramadan, though the sunnah is to do it in the last 10 days of Ramadan, as that is when the Prophet intended to perform the i'tikaf, and that's the only time he intended to perform the i'tikaf. If you stop performing the i'tikaf halfway through, let's say, you do not need to make it up, because the i'tikaf is mustahab and it is not wajib. Let us finish the Siyaam with some review questions. So question number 1. How does a fasting person react when faced with somebody abusing him? Question number 2. What are the 3 conditions for your fasting to be truly broken? Question number 3. When should we seek the Laylatul Qadr?